Coercion, Custom, and Contract at Work by Johnson. I don't know what the first name is. The freedom of workers to seek out those employments that best suited their abilities and preferences was seen by classical economists as a necessary element of an efficient economy. Without such freedom, the invisible hand of the market could not nudge workers from less to more productive employments. Hence the antipathy of classical economists to those myriad archaic laws and customs which interfered with the free working of the labor market. Adam Smith complained at length about apprenticeship and restrictions on the movement of workers, even though many of these restrictions were of limited significance by the 1770s. Although the principal restrictions of the 1563 Statute of Artificers related to the fixing of wages by local justices and to the 7-year duration of apprenticeship were not repealed until 1813 and 1814, respectively, they were largely ignored by the end of the 18th century. A Tudor statute originally designed to respond to the disruptive economic effects of rural vagrancy had diminished relevance to a more integrated, more urban, more commercial economy which in some years during the Napoleonic Wars exhibited clear signs of general labor shortage. Although a number of local attempts, successful and unsuccessful, were made in the early 1800s to use the provisions of the statute to obtain an increase in the formal wage rate and to preserve apprenticeship restrictions, they are notable for their rarity. By this date, the more common view, at least among parliamentarians, was that, quote, no interference of the legislature with the freedom of trade or with the perfect liberty of every individual to dispose of his time and of his labor in the way and on the terms which he may judge most conducive to his own interest, can take place without violating general principles of the first importance to the prosperity and happiness of the community, end quote. These general principles were those of classical economics, in which the forces of supply and demand were given free rein to find the price which would clear the unregulated market. But this popular interpretation of how the labor market should work and how wages should be determined represented a rather narrow interpretation of the complex and confusing set of classical economic theorems about wages. Adam Smith devoted 2 chapters of The Wealth of Nations to the process of wage determination, one dealing with the principles that set the general level of wages within the economic system, the other dealing with the variation of wages between different types of employment. In aggregate, he suggested wages were paid out of the stock or capital of the employer in advance of the sale of the product of labor. Thus, quote, the demand for those who live by wages, it is evident, cannot increase but in proportion to the increase of the funds which are destined for the payment of wages, end quote. This idea that there was a given pool of resources from which wages can be paid, a quote, wages fund, end quote, became a central tenet of classical economic ideology until the late 1860s and lingered on in popular beliefs well beyond that date. Ricardo played an important role by linking the idea of a given stock of wage goods in the economy to the Malthusian population principle. With a given wages fund, an increase in population would raise labor supply relative to demand, thus forcing wages back down to their, quote, natural, end quote, level, which was commonly held to be a subsistence level which would permit the reproduction of the labor force. This model of a natural process of aggregate wage determination was adhered to by virtually all political economists from Smith to John Stuart Mill and was disseminated to a wider public through newspaper articles, parliamentary discussions, and through didactic writings by the popularizers of political economy. Jean Marcet, I'm not sure that's how to say it. I'll just say Marcet. Jane Marcet's Conversation on Political Economy, in which elements of that science are familiarly explained, 1816, contained the following exchange between a precocious pupil, Caroline, and her teacher, Miss B. Caroline says, "What is it that determines the rate of wages?" Miss B says, "It depends upon the proportion which capital bears to the laboring part of the population of the country." Caroline, or in other words, to the proportion which subsistence bears to the number of people to be maintained by it. Miss B. Yes, it is this alone which regulates the rate of wages when they are left to pursue their natural course. A logical extension of this wage fund doctrine was that efforts by workers to force up their rate of pay by collective action were destined to fail in all but the short run. If employers raised wages today in excess of the wages fund, then the capital available to pay labor tomorrow would be diminished by a similar amount, and thus wages, or the size of the workforce, would have to fall to bring the system back into equilibrium. In her Illustrations of Political Economy of 1832, Harriet Martineau put this idea into the mouth of a sympathetic employer, Wentworth, in his conversation with workers contemplating a strike. Quote, "If the masters had more capital than was necessary to pay you all at the rate you have hitherto received, you might gain your point by a strike, not as you sometimes do, just for a little time till the masters can shake themselves free of their engagement, but permanently. But this is not the case. The master's capital does not return enough to pay you all the rate you desire. If they are to keep their capital entire, you must take less wages, or fewer of you must take wages at all. If you will all have the wages you desire, the capital which pays them wastes away, and ruin approaches." End quote. Thus, workers were trapped by what in 1863 Ferdinand Lassalle, I want to see how you pronounce that guy's name. I always say LaSalle, but I'm also curious. One second.
Ferdinand Lassalle.
Okay, it is LaSalle. The reason I was curious was that sometimes in German words, or a lot of times in German words, if there's an E in the end, it ends with an sound. So, thus workers were trapped by what in 1863 Ferdinand Lassalle called the, quote, iron law, end quote, of wages. Attempts to raise wages through collective action could succeed only in the short run, while in the long run, the Malthusian population principle would drive wages down towards the subsistence level. The wages fund set the short-run limit to the demand for labor, and population growth set the long-run limit to supply. The wage rate was the market-determined outcome. Yet this was far from being the only theory of wage determination that existed within classical economics. Smith had also prompted a productivity theory of wages when he stated that the, quote, the produce of labor constitutes the natural recompense or wages of labor, end quote. A principle that derived from his residual conception of a labor theory of value, something that was developed and formalized by Ricardo, but more directly relevant to the actual working of the labor market was Smith's bargaining theory of wages. Smith noted that, quote, "What are the common wages of labor depends everywhere upon the contract usually made between masters and workmen, whose interests are by no means the same. The workmen desire to get as much, the masters to give as little as possible. The former are disposed to combine in order to raise, the latter in order to lower the wages of labor. End quote. Smith went on to note that this bargaining game was not symmetric for three reasons. First, because there were many fewer masters than workers, masters found it easier to make secret collective agreements and to monitor and enforce them. Second, the law authorized or at least permitted collective agreements among masters, whereas it prohibited them among workmen. Third, the greater resources of masters enabled them to endure a labor dispute for longer than could the majority of wage laborers. Smith did not regard this asymmetry as a problem. He deplored the, quote, violence and outrage, end quote, that sometimes accompanied labor disputes, and noted that, quote, partly from the interposition of the civil magistrate, partly from the superior steadiness of the masters, partly from the necessity which the greater part of the workmen are under of submitting for the sake of present subsistence, end quote. These disputes generally ended in nothing for the workers, other than, quote, the punishment or ruin of the ringleaders, end quote. This bargaining theory of wage determination is not necessarily at odds with the idea inherent in the wages fund model, and that the price of labor is determined by the forces of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. In fact, the bargaining process would be viewed as short-run, quote, noise, end quote, around a long-run equilibrium wage. On the other hand, if the causes of the asymmetry identified by Smith were long-standing or structural, there would be no good reason for believing that the market wage achieved by the bargaining process would be identical to the equilibrium wage in a truly free market. In fact, in this situation, labor would be mispriced, resources would be misallocated, and the invisible hand of the market would be incapable of reestablishing the optimal conditions of production. This potential difficulty did not unduly trouble the majority of Smith's 19th century followers, who considered the political economy of wages to be encapsulated by the twin ideas of the wages fund and the subsistence principle. Mill, in his Principles of Political Economy, reiterated the wages fund theory when stating that, quote, wages depend mainly upon the demand and supply of labor, or, as it is often expressed, on the proportion between population and capital, end quote. Mill. I believe that's James Mill, not John Stuart Mill. He then explicitly ruled out any significant role for bargaining by claiming that, quote, wages not only depend upon the relative amount of capital and population, but cannot, under the rule of competition, be affected by anything else, end quote. No, yeah, let me see. Oh, never mind. All right. Although the, quote, wages fund, end quote, of any economy could not be directly identified or measured, this idealistic concept framed the practical analysis of the labor market undertaken by economists and legislators throughout the first half of Victoria's reign. It was not until 1866 that a direct attempt at refutation was attempted on the grounds that there exists within the economy no special ring-fenced fund solely devoted to the payment of labor. The critique was elaborated and extended by William Thornton in 1869, who pointed out that for a general, quote, wages fund, end quote, of a fixed value to exist, there must be similar smaller funds held by each and every employer, and it was on empirical fact that no such funds existed. In a review of Thornton's book, Mill famously recanted his views, quote, the doctrine hitherto taught by all or most economists bracket, including myself, end bracket, which denied it to be possible that trade combinations can raise wages, or which limited their operation in that respect to the somewhat earlier attainment of a rise which the competition of the market would have produced without them. This doctrine is deprived of its scientific foundation and must be thrown aside. The right and wrong of the proceedings of trades unions becomes a common question of prudence and social duty, not one which is peremptorily decided by unbending necessities of political economy. End quote. John Stuart Mill. This change of mind by Mill, whose name, quote, stood for political economy, end quote, rendered void the common argument that strike activity by unions was necessarily self-defeating. The contemporaneous publication of the report of the Royal Commission on Trade Unions and the subsequent passage in 1871 of the Trade Union Act and the Criminal Law Amendment Act recognized the legality of trade unions, gave them protection of their funds, and repealed the aggressive combination laws which had been used to criminalize picketing and other collective actions by union members. Henceforth, the bias in the law against combinations of workmen was, if not completely eradicated, massively reduced. In the intellectual and legal adjustments of the late 1860s and early 1870s, the intellectual and legal adjustments of the late 1860s and early 1870s were clearly of great significance to organized labor, but they may have had only a marginal impact on the general working of the labor market. Trade union membership was small. Even by 1892 it encompassed only 10% of the labor force. And although Smith appeared to think that employers regularly and repeatedly colluded with each other to keep wages down, the evidence is sparse. As McIver has shown, before the 1850s, employer combinations were, quote, brief, temporary, and ephemeral, end quote, and formal employer associations really developed only from the 1880s. In the majority of trades, untouched by trade unionism and the heavy hand of the combination laws, bargaining over wages should have approximated to that ideal process of, quote, higgling, end quote, by which buyers and sellers freely interact in order to agree a fair market price. But for most of the 19th century, this model labor market existed only in the minds of those who accepted the assumptions and theories of political economy. For the 100 years following the publication of Smith's Wealth of Nations, labor in Britain was constrained, coerced, and at times terrorized by the semi-feudal provisions of the Master and Servant Acts. I just had to stop the recording because there's a bird outside that was so fucking loud. I was like, is it in the goddamn house? I was like, what the hell is that? I don't know if you can hear it. You can still hear it now. Sounds like a I don't know, like you squeezing a squeezy ball. Anyway. Poor Mary Dawson. Teenagers are wont to express a definite sense of when they have been wronged. Mary Dawson was adamant that she had been traduced by her former employer, Mr. Hattersley. Mary was born and bred in the woolen town of Kiley, in the West Riding of Yorkshire, and like many of her peer group, she began working life in one of the local woolen mills. In March 1847, she was hired by Hattersley as a weaver, and was put to work at a power loom at which there was a warp partly woven. She finished the piece of cloth and several others before being placed at another loom where there were 2 or 3 warps. She hired another teenage girl to help her, but found she could not complete the work and make enough to pay her assistant's wages because the conditions of the warp was so bad. She therefore left her job to take up work for another mill owner, Mr. Mitchell, who was reputed to offer a higher rate of pay than did Hattersley. An ordinary story of an ordinary worker responding to simple economic incentives, a model of how a free labor market should work. But the labor market of mid-19th century Britain was anything but free, as Mary Dawson found out on the 30th of April, 1847. On that day, a constable acting under the authority of the Huddersfield magistrates entered Mitchell's mill, arrested Mary for breach of contract, and without giving her time to change her weaving clogs or her mill dress, hurried her through the crowded streets of Kiley to the railway station and conveyed her to Wakefield House of Correction. There she was placed on the treadmill in the company of prostitutes and common criminals. After 3 weeks of incarceration, by which time she was unable to walk unaided because her feet were so swollen, her father managed to secure her release. Mary's original sentence was for 1 month's imprisonment with hard labor, and her early release was due entirely to the assiduous pleading of her father, John Dawson. He believed that she had been wrongly imprisoned and asked the committing magistrates to provide him with details of the specific legislation of which she was deemed to be in breach. The magistrates refused, at which point John Dawson approached William Ferrand, MP of Knaresborough, and a conservative paternalist who, quote, looked upon labor as the source of all wealth and the well-being of the productive classes as a chief duty of government, end quote. Ferrand raised Mary's case with the Home Secretary, and it was this intervention which led to her release. Did the abrupt termination of Mary's imprisonment mean that her incarceration had been illegal from the outset, as her father and William Ferrand believed? Yes and no. The inquiry of the Home Secretary, Sir George Grey, revealed that there was some doubt as to the legality of Mary's conviction. This related not to any uncertainty as to the nature of Mary's action, but rather to a technical issue regarding the specific act of Parliament under which the committal had taken place. The magistrates had proceeded under the 1843 Worstead Embezzlement Act, whereas they should have proceeded under the 1777 Fraudulent Hatters Act, which was one of several master and servant acts introduced in the 18th century. Mr. Ferrand was probably correct to argue that the Worstead Embezzlement Act, which he viewed as, quote, one of the most tyrannical and oppressive acts that was ever passed by the legislature, end quote, applied only to those who worked at looms in their own dwellings. In the 1777 Act, however, the 1777 Act, however, had a much wider reach. Most of this act related to the theft of materials, but Section 8 explicitly dealt with the contract of employment. Quote, if any person, being hired, retained, or employed, to prepare or work up any materials, whether mixed or unmixed, for any master or masters, shall wilfully neglect or refuse the performance thereof for 8 days consecutively, or shall procure or permit himself or herself to be employed or retained in any other occupation or employment, whatever sooner than 8 days before the completion of the work first taken, then such person shall be sent to the House of Correction or other public prison, where to be kept to hard labor for any length of time not exceeding 3 months, nor less than 1 month. End quote. Ferrand presented 2 distinct arguments to support his claim that Mary had been illegally imprisoned. First, since Mary was a minor under 21 years of age, she could not legally commit to a contract, and her father had not entered into a contract with Hattersley for her employment. Second, Mary had committed no offense against the law or any rule in Hattersley's mill, since, quote, there was no general rule at Kiley related to weavers with regard to the setting on or turning of off hands, end quote. Furthermore, The absence of any local custom of extended employment contracts was demonstrated by the fact that on the very day that Mary decided to leave her work unfinished, Hattersley had apparently turned a weaver off a loom, quote, without a moment's notice, end quote. The government denied that the imprisonment was illegal. Mary's actions were in clear breach of the 1777 Act. Quote, it was shown that 12 pieces had been delivered to her and that she had woven 9 pieces and a half, leaving 2 and a half unfinished. Then she absented herself from her employment and went into the service of another mill owner, where she got better wages and better work, end quote. The only legal issue was whether the committal had been made under the correct act, and since there was uncertainty about this, Mary was given the benefit of the doubt and released before the expiry of her 1-month sentence. It remained open to Mary to seek redress for any improper imprisonment by appealing to a court of law, a suggestion that Ferran thought, quote, ridiculous, end quote. Quote, the idea of a girl working for a few shillings a week bringing an action that would cost £100 or £150 against 2 magistrates was absurd, end quote. So ended the case of poor Mary Dawson, put on the treadmill for 3 weeks for thinking and acting as if the classical economic principles of a free labor market really applied to mid-19th century Britain. It was exceptional for mill girls to be discussed in the House of Commons, but it was commonplace for the Master and Servant Acts to be used to coerce workers. Just 7 weeks after Mary was arrested while working at her loom, the Huddersfield magistrates were again using the 1777 Act to bring workers to heel. Quote, Benjamin Lodge, a weaver in the employ of Mr. Norton of Cumberworth Half, was brought up by that gentleman for having neglected his work for 8 consecutive days. On the second instance, as many as 150 weavers in Mr. Norton's employ turned out, it is said, in consequence of an attempted reduction in their wages, and they have not been near their work since. Mr. N. therefore brought up Lodge and 3 others to be made examples of in order to induce the others to return to finish their work. Lodge was committed for a month, end quote. The survival of coercive elements of the Statute of Artificers into the 19th century was not the incidental outcome of legislative inertia. In 1823, Parliament added new restrictions to the master and servant laws, paying particular attention to the specific issue of contract. From this date, the law explicitly penalized any, quote, servant, end quote, who, having signed a written labor contract, failed to commence work as agreed. Furthermore, it recognized the informal nature of most labor agreements by stating that once work had commenced, any failure to complete this work according to contract, quote, whether such contract shall be in writing or not, end quote, presented employers with grounds for proceeding with criminal action against the worker. In 1843, the Warstead Embezzlement Act explicitly applied criminal sanction to the breach of contract by domestic outworkers in 7 specific trades, thereby nullifying the King's Bench ruling of 1829, which had effectively placed home peace workers beyond the reach of the 1823 Act. The following year, a bill was introduced which would have extended this criminal sanction to, quote, all laborers and persons, end quote, regardless of their trade, and have been specifically enumerated in any way of the preceding Master and Servant Acts, and even when, quote, the relations of master and servant may not actually subsist between laborers or the other persons and their employers, end quote. The rationale for this extension of the master and servant provision to all forms of wage labor was uncertainty created by earlier legal judgments about what activities in which contexts were covered by the existing laws. Once the bill was introduced into Parliament, the Chartist solicitor, W.P. Roberts, alerted the labor movement to the threat posed by the bill, and the Potters' Union was particularly active in organizing opposition throughout the Midlands. Over 200 petitions, said to represent over 2 million workmen, were received by the House of Commons. With forceful opposition from radical reformers, the bill was defeated. This did not mean, however, that the provisions of the Master and Servant Acts remained confined to narrowly specified trades. Over the next 20 years, a series of court judgments developed an expansive reading of the 1823 Act to cover an extremely broad range of waged work, regardless of whether the engagement was for a specified term or for a specified task. Thus, by mid-century, time work and piece work were held equally to fall under the remit of the Master and Servant Acts. By the mid-Victorian labor markets came to be regulated by an increasingly anachronistic reading of a 16th century statute. The section of the 1563 Statute of Artificers, which related to leaving work unfinished, was framed in terms of the specific tasks undertaken and duties discharged by artificers and servants. This made sense in an economy in which virtually all production was, quote, bespoke, end quote, in the sense of individual workers manufacturing unique products. The 19th century legislation preserved this language, yet the organization of production was by then very different. By the 1840s, many working men and women in textile, metal, and engineering trades literally never finished their work, because for them, as for the stylized worker in Adam Smith's pin factory, their daily labor involved not the complete making and finishing of a good or object, but the performance of an intermediate process. Although the continuous production line was not to emerge until the 1920s, the application of the principle of division of labor fundamentally changed many 19th century manufacturing jobs from craft to process work. It is by no means always the case that archaic laws have significant effects. Many ancient laws linger on the statute books without ever being used in a court of law. Most historical accounts of labor in 19th century Britain pay little or no attention to the Master and Servant Acts. The Webbs, for instance, mention them just twice in their classic History of Trade Unionism, and Daphne Simon's Marxist account of the waning of the master and servant laws represents them as a largely dysfunctional inheritance from feudal times with little relevance to 19th century work, except in those few sections of the economy where pre-modern relations of production between small masters and workmen endured. In fact, criminal prosecution of workers for breach of contract in mid-Victorian England appears to have been widely used across a wide range of employments, including coal mining and iron industry, building, printing, transport, engineering, tool and cutlery making, glass and pottery manufacture, coach building, boiler making, and common laboring. This resort to law was not the preserve of small employers. Among the cotton spinners of Preston and Blackburn, the prosecution of workers for leaving work without notice was, quote, an almost weekly occurrence, end quote, in mid-century. In the case of the Preston firm Horrocks, the largest integrated cotton firm in the world in the first half of the 19th century, prosecution of absent workers was part and parcel of an aggressive approach to labor management that included periodic pay cuts. In the part of South Staffordshire known as the Black Country, an area with a particularly high rate of prosecution, which Simon explained by reference to the concentration of pre-modern workshop production, at least one-third of cases were brought by large-scale iron and coal masters. Furthermore, criminal prosecution of workers for breach of contract appears to have become more common over the course of the 19th century, even as the relations of production were becoming more modern. The evidence is patchy because master and servant actions were generally heard only in magistrates' courts, and no comprehensive data were collected and reported until the 1850s. But local studies by Douglas Hay indicate a rise in the number of master and servant offenders imprisoned between the last quarter of the 18th century and the first quarter of the 19th. From 1857 to 1875, the picture is clearer. The number of criminal prosecutions averaged about 10,000 per annum, fluctuating between an annual minimum of 7,385 and maximum of 17,082. The overall trend for these years is upward, with the final 5 years, 1871 to 5, averaging 14,000 prosecutions annually. Years of peak prosecution, 1860, 1866, 1872, coincided with peaks in the trade cycle. and analysis of the data by Robert Steinfeld demonstrates that when unemployment rates were low, employers resorted to the disciplining device of prosecutions more frequently. And if you're curious, the significance of that is that when unemployment rates are high, you don't really labor discipline is usually better because people are scared of losing their jobs. When unemployment rates are low, labor gets a little more confident in itself, generally speaking, because there's such a high demand for the commodity labor power that they're selling. So it would make sense that when unemployment rates are low, that employers begin to resort to non-market-based forms of discipline beyond, what some Marxists you call mute compulsion. Anyway, employers could be reasonably confident of a sympathetic hearing because the legal process was massively biased in their favor. Cases could be heard by a local justice of the peace sitting alone, and such persons were usually well connected economically and socially with local employers. In fact, in industrial districts, they were often one and the same. For example, in 1859, almost 44% of black country magistrates were iron and steel masters, and in a number of towns in the heart of the district, they made up the entire local bench. By mid-century in Lancashire, the Lancashire cotton town of Preston, 11 of the 19 magistrates were cotton masters. The geographical distribution of master and servant cases over the period of 1857 to 75 shows a clear link between manufacturing and resort to law. In 1860, Cheshire, Derbyshire, Staffordshire, and Shropshire all experienced more than 11.5 prosecutions per 10,000 population, with Lancashire, Durham, and Yorkshire having between 8.5 and 11.5 prosecutions per 10,000 population. On the other hand, counties such as Cumberland, Westmoreland, Norfolk, Suffolk, Kent, Sussex, Oxfordshire, Dorset, and Devon had fewer than 3.5 prosecutions per 10,000 population. In some towns in the Black Country, the rates were much higher. In Wolverhampton, they reached a maximum of 45 per 10,000, and in Walsall, 39 per 10,000. Given that middle-class and elderly-headed households were largely untouched by this law, and with an average household size of around 5, these data suggest that in the industrial counties of England in the mid-Victorian period, the annual chance of a working-class household suffering criminal prosecution for breach of labor contract lay between 1 in 50 and 1 in 200, a sufficiently high rate for knowledge of the risk to be well known within working-class communities. Once prosecuted, about 60% of workers were convicted, and many of the 40% that received a discharge did so because, under duress, they had agreed to return to work. Of those convicted, around 1/4 received a prison sentence, about 1,500 people a year. A quarter were fined, and the remainder suffered abatement of wages in order to compensate their former employer for losses incurred. Of course, breach of contract could as much be the result of action by the employer as by the worker, and the master and servant laws recognize this by providing explicit authority for workers to recover wages due. In a sample of 670 master and servant cases from Walsall over an 18-year period from 1858, prosecutions by workers against employers accounted for 13.4% of the total. However, there was a structural asymmetry in the application of the law to these work-originated cases. A master sued by a worker could be a witness in his own defense, but until 1867, a worker prosecuted by an employer could not give evidence on his own behalf, and thus frequently was unable to offer any defense at all. Furthermore, whereas it was a criminal offense for a worker to break a contract, punishable up to 3 months imprisonment with hard labor, breach of contract by an employer was a civil offense only, with sanction against employers limited to payment of wages claimed plus cost. There was also an ambiguity about exactly what an employer's implied obligation was to a worker for the duration of a contract that specified a term of employment. Many employers sought to bind workers for a term without explicitly binding themselves to provide work, although there was a risk that if challenged in court, such a contract might be declared void on grounds of lack of mutuality. But by the 1850s, this issue had been resolved in favor of employers. As long as the employer did not explicitly commit to provide a minimum amount of work or a minimum level of wages, he could suspend a worker without pay or put the worker on short time without rendering the contract void, if he could justify such action by reference to the circumstances of the trade. Since most labor contracts were verbal rather than written, and since magistrates were more likely to take the word of an employer than a worker in any dispute over what was or was not promised, the chances of a worker being able to gain compensation from an employer for breach of contract were slight. Despite the blatant unfairness of the master and servant laws, there is little sign that they engaged the interests of the early labor movement, apart from the brief flurry in 1844. Although the number of workers prosecuted under the master and servants law far exceeded prosecutions under the combination and conspiracy laws, it was these latter laws that most exercised trade unions because they directly impinged on the ability of workers to organize and act collectively. It was not until 1863 that a movement for a reform of the laws of master and servant commenced, starting in the Glasgow Trades Council, gradually incorporating other trade councils and unions, receiving acknowledgement, if not outright support, from the National Association for the Promotion of Social Science, and leading to an abortive private members' bill for reform of the law in 1864. A select committee was appointed to hear evidence from both sides of industry, and ensuing Master and Servant Act 1867 reflected a compromise. Quote, simple, end quote, breaches of contract would henceforth be punished solely with a fine, but, quote, aggravated, end quote, breaches which cause, quote, injury to persons or property, end quote, could still lead directly to imprisonment. Employers and workers were now to be equally subject to these punishments. Those loose phrasing of the, quote, aggravated misconduct, end quote, clause, together with the wide discretion allowed to local magistrates over interpretation of the law, meant that this reform fell well short of abolition of imprisonment for breach of contract. From a pre-reform level of around 1,500 custodial sentences per annum, the number fell to around 500, although there was no reduction in the overall number of prosecutions. In fact, as already noted, these rose to record levels during the economic boom of 1872-3. The continued application of master and servant laws against workers remained a bone of contention for organized labor. As the trade unionist T.J. Dunning complained, the law tended to categorize industrial labor almost under the, quote, what's going on here? The law, okay, sorry, there was something weird going on with my computer. The law tended to categorize industrial labor almost under, quote, the old feudal notion of serfdom, end quote. In 1874, Frederick Harrison wrote a powerful critique of the amended master and servant law, arguing that it was a, quote, miserable remnant of class oppression, end quote. He pointed out that although the, quote, aggravated misconduct, end quote, clause was technically neutral between employee and employer, quote, the penalties of this clause, verbally so equal, fall exclusively on one class. Workmen, as a fact, are imprisoned, and masters, as a fact, are not, end quote. As befitted a positivist who had trained as a barrister in the chambers of Sir Henry Maine, Harrison objected to the continued application of legal sanction on the basis of the status of the individual rather than the nature of the contract. Quote, The contracts of commercial and ordinary affairs often involve very great interests. Men are ruined, and families are desolated every day by deliberate breach of solemn engagements. When a contractor puts bad materials in a bridge or a ship, he risks the lives of hundreds. The overtrading of a few speculators may bring on a national panic, and the jobs of a knot of directors cause more suffering than a bad winter. Now a breach of contract of this class amounts morally to a public crime, but where no penal statute is broken, it is absolutely unpunished. Yet if a workman neglects a day's labor, price say 5 shillings, he is liable to 3 months' imprisonment. The sudden loss of a workman's labor may often be a serious matter, but it is preposterous to pretend that it can approach in consequence the stoppage of a bank." End quote. It was less the eloquence of Harrison's critique, however, and more the newly elected conservative government's desire to appeal to the expanded working-class electorate that led to the repeal of the master and servant laws in 1875. The Royal Commission on the Labor Laws, appointed in 1874, recommended that penal sanction for, quote, aggravated, end quote, breach of contract be maintained, but the Employers and Workmen Act of 1875, carried through Parliament by Home Secretary Richard Cross, went much further than this by eliminating the concept of misconduct and misdemeanor from the legislation and making breach of contract a purely civil offense for both parties. From this date, the legal treatment of employers and workers over issues of contract enforcement became symmetric. What the impact of this was on the working of the labor market is unclear. The fact that the master and servant laws were used right up to the point of their repeal, and with increased vigor in their final few years, indicates that employers believed they obtained real value from resort to law. Quite apart from the several thousand workers who were directly disciplined in the magistrate courts each year, there was a broader demonstration effect. As the vice president of the Mining Association of Great Britain told the 1866 Select Committee, quote, "The moral effect of having the power is often, quote, sufficient." But sufficient for what? Woods was arguing that the master and servant laws were used by employers for two distinct but related purposes: as an instrument of industrial discipline, especially with regard to strike activity, and a means of restricting the free movement of labor. As the behavior of the woolen manufacturer, Mr. Norton, cited above, makes clear, employers who were experiencing industrial action by their workforce could intimidate strikers by using the master and servant laws to threaten them with imprisonment. This was a much easier route than resort to combination or conspiracy laws, since it required no evidence to be furnished about the degree of organization and collusion on the part of the workers. Furthermore, the master and servant laws could be used against all striking workers, not just the ringleaders. When 500 stokers at the Beckton, East London gasworks went on strike in late 1872, each one of them was summoned before the magistrates, and 24 of their number were imprisoned for 6 weeks with hard labor for, quote, aggravated, end quote, breach of contract. The abolition of the master and servant laws in 1875 and the simultaneous legalization of peaceful picketing by means of the Conspiracy and Protection of Property Act clearly reduced the ability of employers to resist the collective demands of their workers through the use of state-sanctioned coercion. The significance of these legal changes was fully recognized by organized labor. The 8th Trade Union Congress in Glasgow in October 1875 carried a vote of thanks to the Conservative Home Secretary Cross for his labor law reforms amid virtually unanimous applause. The following year, George Howe, Secretary to the Parliamentary Committee of the Trade Union Congress, described these acts as, quote, a great boon to the industrial classes, as in fact the charter of their social and industrial freedom, end quote. Abolition of the master and servant laws also reduced the capacity of employers to limit labor mobility. It would be noted that not all employment in mid-Victorian Britain was subject to master and servant restrictions, because some workers were explicitly engaged on the basis of, quote, minute contracts, end quote, which could be terminated at will by either party. Such contracts were the norm for Scottish but not English miners and for unskilled dock workers. However, Steinfeld, in his pioneering study of the content and context of the master and servant laws, concludes that, quote, employment at will was far from being the norm in England in the 1860s. Most trades maintained contacts determinable on a fortnight or month's notice, end quote, and some still operated with annual contracts. These arrangements enabled employers to restrict labor turnover and to restrain the use of wage premia in competitive bidding for scarce labor in local labor markets. Mary Dawson was just one of the many workers each year who found that pursuit of higher wages could lead to a prison sentence. There was, of course, a potential downside for employers who, during periods of trade depression, could find themselves committed to maintaining employment for their contracted workers. However, as noted above, by mid-century case law had evolved so as to allow employers generally to shirk these obligations without cost. Moreover, the fact that prosecutions under the Master and Servant Acts continued at fairly high levels during periods of trade depression indicates that employers felt they could benefit from applying these coercive laws even in slack labor markets. After the 1875, it was still possible for both employers and workers to pursue, through the civil courts, claims for compensation for losses arising from breach of contract. In addition to individual disputes, trade unions used the law against employers who unilaterally broke formal collective agreements, and some employers, particularly in the Durham coal field, continued to use mass summons against strikers, although now their claims had to be limited to financial compensation for proven losses. Overall, the number of breach of contract cases after 1875 was barely half of that of the early 1870s. The 1875 legislation clearly strengthened the bargaining position of labor, but also important was the adoption by organized labor of new, more aggressive wage theories following Mill's recantation of the concept of the, quote, wages fund, end quote. The old political economy, which had been widely accepted by organized labor, conceived of trade union wage bargaining as an essentially zero-sum game, in which the current wage victories above and beyond the, quote, natural, end quote, market rates would inevitably be balanced by future losses. The new economic ideas of the 1870s and 1880s liberated unions from this conceptual straitjacket and encouraged them to pursue action in defense of wages with increased vigor and intellectual confidence. Both real wages and the labor share of national income rose over the last quarter of the 19th century. The proximate cause of the rise in real wages was a secular decline in the cost of food, itself a function of greater imports of cheap grain and later meat from New World producers. But the fact that workers were able to retain these gains by resisting pressure for reductions in money wages is indicative of a real change in the relative bargaining position of labor and capital. From the mid-1870s, the powerful combination of legal reform and ideological advance allowed labor to hold on to wage gains, an achievement which coincides with the establishment of a labor market in Britain, which, from a legal point of view, began to resemble the stylized model of classical political economy.